Fleetwood, Sunday, March 21st. WNBC, in cooperation with the Poetry Center of the YM and YWHA, 92nd Street and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan, brings you Anthology, a selection of readings from poets past and present, and the music to accompany their poetry. Our guest this afternoon, John Malcolm Brennan, director of the Poetry Center. Buried in the motion picture section of the Daily News for Tuesday, March 16th, was an item which we'd file into the category of, oh, really? We didn't know that. The heading, Poe Memorial, and we quote, "On March 19th at midnight, marking 145 years and 2 months ago the birth of Edgar Allan Poe, the Paramount Theater will dedicate to the Mystery Writers of America a special performance of Warner Brothers' Phantom of the Rue Morgue. The house will begin its regular showings of the film on Friday morning." Unquote. We trust the memorial was a suitably chilling event. And since Mr. Poe was also a poet of considerable stature, we feel that Anthology should mark this occasion, too. One of his poems, which we've always admired, is called A Dream Within a Dream. "Take this kiss upon thy brow, and in parting from you now, this much let me avow. You are not wrong to deem that my days have been a dream. Yet if hope has flown away in a night or in a day, in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep, while I weep. O God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? O God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream?" In memoriam, Edgar Allan Poe, 145 years, 2 months, and 2 days after his birth. Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of gray. The figure of Lincoln looms over the American landscape like a sky-searching mountain peak. It seems to have stood there since the beginning of time, and it is hard to realize that it is scarcely 100 years old. Here, truly, history has become the lengthened shadow of a man, a mortal man who has become an immortal legend. Those are Louis Untermeyer's comments on our 16th president. We find them a worthy addition to the vast library of prose and poetry which has been written about Abraham Lincoln. On the poetry side of the ledger, another worthy addition, Rosemary Benet's Nancy Hanks. On this recording, the brilliant American actress Agnes Moorehead portrays Lincoln's mother, returning to this earth 100 years after her death. Here is a combination of pride and pathos which lends to the Lincoln legend a new and surprising beauty.
As a ghost, seeking news of what she loved most, he'd ask first,
"Where's my son? What's happened to Abe? What's he done? Poor little Abe, left all alone, except for Tom, who the Rolling Stone. He was only 9 the year I died. I remember still how hard he cried, scraping along in a little shack with hardly a shirt to cover his back, and a prairie wind blowing down, or pinching time if he went to town. You wouldn't know about my son. Did he grow tall? Did he have fun? Did he learn to read? Did he get to town? Do you know his name? Did he get on?
We believe that poetry is an art form which may assume many different disguises. For example, a few weeks ago, we read excerpts from the poetic prose of Thomas Wolfe. And next week, we are to enjoy the unusual experience of hearing poetry in sound, when the first of our 2 guests will be Tony Schwartz. Tony's a young man who has an ear for the sounds of the city and the very complicated sound system with which he records them. A year or so ago, Folkways Records released 1, 2, 3, and a Zing, 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 his collection of street games and songs of the children of the city. On Sunday, we'll hear excerpts from New York 19, Tony's newest record. We promise you a most entertaining, exciting, and poetic treat. Treat number 2 will be the appearance on Anthology of this distinguished novelist and poet, William Carlos Williams. Dr. Williams, who is a practicing physician in his hometown of Rutherford, New Jersey, will journey to New York to talk to us concerning his writings and to read from his latest book, The Desert Music and Other Poems, which will be published this month by Random House. Remember the date, next Sunday, March 28th, Tony Schwartz and William Carlos Williams on Anthology. I couldn't think of a more appropriate musical salute than the fanfare from Facade to introduce our special guest this afternoon. His name, John Malcolm Brennan, director of the Poetry Center of the YM and YWHA. Mr. Brennan, I understand this is an important week, not only for the Poetry Center, but also for the Y itself. Could you tell us about it? What's the important goings-on at the Y?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the important event is the reappearance of Dr. Edith Sitwell and Sir Osbert Sitwell in a reading at the Poetry Center on Tuesday evening. Of course, there are many other events going all through the week. The YMHA is a kind of unofficial university in the city. There's so many events going on that I sometimes worry when our speakers arrive that they might be shunted off and end up in the swimming pool or in the basketball court.
In other words, there's a lot that goes on there besides the Poetry Center.
Continually.
And you're not particularly involved, I guess, with the rest of the activities there.
No, I have my own preserve in the Poetry Center.
The Poetry Center is your domain. Well, since the Poetry Center is your domain, then perhaps you could tell us what the Poetry Center has meant and has done up to now, and how long you've been the director of the Poetry Center.
We began about 14 years ago, and although there have been several directors of the Poetry Center, I think we've maintained one guiding principle, one premise under which we invite people to read, and that is that there is a particular value in hearing a poet read his own work. He may be a good reader or a bad reader, but in either case, one does learn something new about his poetry. One feels a connection, one senses an attitude of the man toward his work, and very often a poem read by the poet is illuminating in an entirely new way.
Well, do you encourage new poets? That is to say, do you specialize in the famous poets which we're always talking about here who speak at the Poetry Center? Or does a young man say who, supposing I had written a poem and you hadn't met me on Anthology and I came into the Poetry Center and I showed you this poem and you thought it was pretty good, would you say, well, fine, come in and read it, or would you read it?
We've tried to preserve a balance. We have an auditorium which accommodates 1,000 people, so obviously we couldn't put you on and expect that auditorium would be filled for you. However, we have conducted yearly contests to reward young talents who we could find. We have tried to present poets who are just beginning to be known, along with world-famous figures.
Is the Poetry Center a full-time job for you, or do you indulge in other activities?
I often feel that it is, but it actually isn't. No, I'm an instructor at the University of Connecticut.
Oh, is that right? Well, the Poetry Center, then, is not necessarily an activity which breaks even, shall we say. Where does the money come from, however, which supports the Poetry Center?
On the contrary to your feeling, we do support ourselves. Most people feel that we are supported by a foundation, but no, we pay our way all the way, and it's a constant struggle to keep above water.
I get so used to reading reports, for instance, of symphony concerts where they say even if the house is sold out, they still lose $4,000 or $5,000 per concert. So I naturally assume that if they can't break even with symphony concerts, well, poetry, which is even more special, has a more special audience, I would say, than the symphonic concerts, would have even greater difficulty. But I'm very glad to hear that you do not only break even, but that you manage to make the organization solvent. Well, then you do feel, since obviously you get the poets as often as possible to read their own poetry, then you are obviously on the side of the people who say that poets should read their own poetry. You know, we get a lot of mail during the course of the week, and since I've been on Anthology, I'm constantly running into people who say, oh, why did you have that person read the poem? Or why did you read it, they'll say to me. Why don't you have an actor? And then if we have an actor, they'll say, why didn't you get the poet himself to read it? Everybody seems to have his own theory, I guess, depending on whether he's an actor or a poet. Do you have other people? Do you get actors in, say, to read poetry for you?
We have that on occasion. We try to vary our whole season of programs, but our main thing is to hear the poet himself. Very often we know that other people might read the poems in a superior way. At the same time, some value is lost, and many people are interested in that particular meeting of the poet upon his work.
When the poet reads poetry, does he usually give a lecture besides? Does he talk about his work? Does he say how he created it? Does he perhaps try to give clues to up-and-coming young poets as to how they might get the poetic muse, so to speak, to come and inspire them?
Now, that's an individual matter. We make no restriction. Some poets like to explain the background of their poems. Others care nothing about it at all.
One poet who seems to be attracting a lot of attention lately, mainly, of course, because of his tragic death fairly recently, not mainly, of course, but he attracted a great deal of attention prior to that because of his works, but there's been, of course, constant discussion about Dylan Thomas, who died just a few months ago, shortly after an appearance, I believe, at the Poetry Center, did he not?
Yes, he performed in his drama Under Milk Wood on 2 occasions just before his death. He, of course, was our bright particular star in his 3 visits to this country, and the Poetry Center was, in a way, his home base, and we were very proud of his travels all over the country since we had initiated his coming to America. And, of course, in his reading, which I think most people feel is the finest reading of our time, he did bring a whole new dimension into the notion of a poet reading, I think, with great value all over this country.
I remember when I was doing Music Through the Night, a young poet came to me and asked me to make announcements on Music Through the Night in reference to a fund which has been set up for Dylan Thomas's widow, which makes his tragic death seem all the more tragic, that he was not able to leave sufficient funds for her to live on. Do you know anything about that fund firsthand?
Yes. The fund was begun just after his death and is continuing in this country as well as in England. It's under the care of Philip Wittenberg, who is at 70 West 40th Street, and contributions are continually being accepted, and of course they are most urgently needed.
Do you know how the fund is making out? Has it been successful?
I don't have exact figures to give you, but it is a most encouraging response. Of course, the ironic thing we all feel is that why couldn't this have happened during Dylan's lifetime?
Yes, of course. What about the other poets who speak at the Poetry Center? After all, you get to meet them all, and probably know them as well as anybody around New York City. Robert Frost, for instance.
Well, Robert Frost, I think, has that magnificent Yankee approach to his work. Sometimes it seems to me the quality of his work is an axe coming down on wood, and he communicates that rough-grained Yankee aspect of his vision completely. And I think he would illustrate as well as any other case the value of a poet reading his own work. With him particularly, it's all of a piece. The man and the work come together, and that is manifest in everything he does.
And T.S. Eliot, a Yankee who is no longer a Yankee.
Well, Eliot, of course, has seen himself as the aged eagle, and there's a certain starkness in his reading. But I must say, of all poets, I think he pays more attention to reading than any other. He sees reading as something to be prepared for as carefully as one would prepare for singing, and it shows. I think he's a very fine reader.
The Sitwells. Of course, we'll be hearing Dr. Edith Sitwell in a moment.
Well, the Sitwells, of course, represent in our time a grand manner in poetry, and is happy for everyone that they can represent and sustain the grand manner in the very best way. I think they have brought a real excitement to poetry in America, and have set a standard. Sometimes they seem to exemplify for me a notion that Gertrude Stein held, that the business of a writer is to be exciting. And the Sitwells have been continuously exciting, and the very good thing is that they are fine writers, and in an age when so many inferior people try to generate excitement, it is good to refer to them as a kind of standard of what a literary representation can be.
Mr. Britton, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come here and talk to us this afternoon. Again, our congratulations on the 80th anniversary of the Y. And now, as a poetic prologue to the appearance of Dr. Edith and Sir Osbert Sitwell at the Poetry Center this week, excerpts from Facade, read by Dr. Sitwell. Music by William Walton. I read one. And so, Anthology, number 4. Next week, Tony Schwartz and excerpts from New York 19. William Carlos Williams reading from his newest Random House book, The Desert Music and Other Poems. Anthology comes to you with the cooperation of the Poetry Center of the YM and YWHA, Lexington Avenue and 92nd Street in Manhattan. The Y is a project of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies. Turn your spare time into care time. Become a volunteer in a hospital or social service agency of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies. Spend a few hours a week caring for men, women, and children who need your help. Please call Plaza 7-5700 to volunteer for this important service. Remember the number, Plaza 7-5700. Anthology is produced by Steve White, written and directed by Draper Lewis for WNBC. Until next Sunday at 3, this is Fleetwood saying goodbye and good reading.